Welcome, everybody. Thanks for showing up for this lecture. It's the first lecture in our series of lectures in the public humanities this summer. I'm going to say a few words of introduction, not just to you here, but also to the people who will be watching the recording at some point in the future. My name is Tim Lansendorfer. I think most of you actually do know me. I am a research professor at the University of Frankfurt, where I work on literary theory, on literary studies, especially contemporary literature, and on what I call literary studies education, but what actually is, in the spirit of today's lecture, the public literary studies angle. And I have the pleasure of hosting this series, not just for my own benefit, but also for the Network 25 Humans, which is a group of junior researchers that work on the question of what it means to do humanities in the, well, probably 21st century at this stage. And today's speaker is somebody I have been looking forward to hearing speak about this topic, but in general, for quite some time now. Sarah Dillon is professor of English at the University of Cambridge, where she does a lot of work that interests me, and some of that she will present today. I'm just going to very briefly run down sort of her major accomplishments. She has a PhD from the University of Sussex. She worked for a good long while at the University of St. Andrews in Scotland. Now she's at Cambridge. She's written 3 books, 3 monograph books, that is, one of which is called The Palimpsest, which is, unsurprisingly, about the palimpsest as a theoretical and cultural construct. The second is Deconstruction, Feminism, and Film, which also has all the important bits in the title already, which is very, very useful for anybody who wants to buy a book. It's about deconstruction, film, and feminism. There you are. The third book is pretty much the reason why I really wanted to hear her speak, a co-written volume, which is already rare, which she wrote with Claire Craig, that's called Story Listening. Story Listening, I'm just very briefly introduced to you, is a book about the relationship between literary studies, the humanities, and the public, and especially the public understood as the kind of people who are in charge of making important decisions about various kinds of political and social problems. There's a lot of books that speak about the question of why stories are important, right? But those usually go and say, stories are important because we all live in story. We all storyfy our lives. That's not that book so much. That book is more about the question of what specifically does it help us as a society with public servants that need to make decisions, to have experts in stories offer their perspective as experts in stories as part of the decision-making process. It's a fascinating book. I absolutely recommend it. Definitely do go out and read it. Today, she's here in what I'm assuming, although we've not talked in detail about it, with a talk that tags onto this, that is called, What is Public Literary Studies? And with that, I'm just handing this over to you, Sarah. Thank you very much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a fortuitous encounter at the Uses of Literature conference a few years ago now, isn't it? And shows you can still network even when everybody is locked down, which is lovely. Deconstruction, Feminism, Film always makes me laugh because I agonized for so long about that title and in the end just decided to do the does what it says on the tin title. And, you know, it does the job. Right, let me just share my screen and then we'll get going. Is that okay? Can you see? Yeah, brilliant. Okay, so a few weeks ago, some of you may or may not know, there was a big conference at the University of Cambridge on the functions of criticism. And I'm not going to give the talk now that I gave then, but I wanted to open with a little bit of some of that talk, because at that conference, when I gave the opening address, I presented a model of the humanities that accounts for the relationship between discipline, method, object, and knowledge. Now, I think it's important to caveat that, like all models, it's a simplification of complexity, because otherwise it wouldn't be useful. I don't know how many of you know the short story by Borges called On Exactitude in Science, where the residents of a imagined world become so obsessed with mapping that they end up creating maps that actually cover the terrain. It's a lovely kind of warning about the fact that to be useful, a model has to abstract and simplify. And this model, I think, offers a frame with which to think about the types, uses, rigor, and reliability of humanities knowledge and its relationship to various publics. So I wanted to share that model with you here today in order to contextualize then my comments on what we might consider public literary studies or public literary criticism to be, and also think about the challenges that it presents to our discipline. So this is my model of the humanities. You can see that the diagram illustrates it, and there's a key to the relevant terms down at the bottom. So D at the top stands for discipline, which attends to its object or objects, O at the bottom, through M methods. And these methods will necessarily be plural. They'll be determined by disciplinary norms and by evolutions in them, as well as by the suitability of the method to the object under study and the skills and preferences, sometimes ideological, of the scholar. So some methods might be description or analysis through human or machine aided means. These methods then, I argue, form the mode of attention to O at the bottom, the object of study, which can be more or less proper, that is essentially belonging to the discipline. And as a result of D's attention to O via M, K, knowledge is produced. And in the humanities, knowledge might take the form of facts and data, like in the sciences, but it might also take the form of interpretation, argument, explanation. In recent discussions of method in literary studies, and I'm not going to go into them here, but they're behind some of this thinking. I think there's been a lack of differentiation between method used on the one hand and knowledge produced on the other. And I think differentiating between how we approach our objects of study, method, and what the results of doing so are, knowledge, usefully clarifies some of that debate. So the knowledge produced by the humanities disciplines can be relevant to or purposefully produced for different audiences. So knowledge can be produced that feeds back into the discipline, and that's our line going from O back up to D. But also knowledge can be produced that feeds into what I've designated as minus D or negative D, which is basically everything that's not D. And it's this straight line at the bottom that I'm going to focus on today, but why I wanted to give you the picture so I could sort of contextualize where I think that fits in the broader picture of humanities scholarship. So public literary studies might be understood then as the production of knowledge for, and sometimes importantly in collaboration with, stakeholders outside of one's discipline. These publics, as we might talk about them, and it's very common in policy making to talk about publics rather than the public. These publics include other disciplines within academia, but also people in industry, policymakers, cultural media audiences, and stakeholders in other kinds of lay communities. So the English Association and the Institute for English Studies, which are two of the kind of key advocacy bodies for English in the UK, has currently actually been doing some really excellent work showcasing some of this public literary studies work as gathered and represented through our, what we call our research excellence framework impact case studies. And I recently presented at the session that's up in the top left of that slide on literature and technology. I talked there about my public literary work around AI narratives, but there were very interesting presentations from creative writers at the University of Salford who've been using creative writing methodologies to enable inclusive 3D printing practices, work from Birmingham City University on developing automatic linguistic analysis and annotation tools to support collaborative learning, and some work at the University of Exeter on transforming the way art and heritage institutions document preserve and exhibit audiences' engagement with their collections. So all of these videos in the series are now online, and I think it's a really interesting way of starting to showcase the diversity and range of public literary studies practices that are happening in the UK at the moment. If you're interested in the kinds of work and projects taking place, you can even go to the REF 2021 Impact Case Study database, select for English language and literature, and you can see that there's 273 case studies there that were submitted by universities across the UK, precisely cataloguing and explaining public literary studies. Now, the impact case studies are sometimes maligned, so I'm not saying that these are perfect. There is some hoop jumping required to tick the boxes of the ref, but they give an insight into the kind of depth and breadth of work that's happening. So public literary studies then offers, I think, one set of answers to ongoing and in some instances urgent interrogations of why and how literary criticism has value. How we answer that question and communicate the answer to the world determines how people outside of our discipline view it, other academics, decision makers, and prospective students. And as we're seeing at the present, at least in the UK and the US, it has very real consequences for the uptake of the discipline, for public narratives around its viability as a course of study, and for its status and survival within the 21st century academy. So given some of the pressures our discipline is currently under, it's not unsurprisingly all too easy to start to answer questions about our value from a position of defense. And given the nature of our discipline, such answers are also unsurprisingly sometimes merely, and I use that word carefully, rhetorical ones. I understand and am sympathetic to both of these impulses, but my experience over my career of representing and practicing our discipline in a whole range of public spaces, from BBC broadcasting to research projects funded by industry to collaborations with other disciplines within the academy to work with policymakers, all of this has instilled in me an absolute confidence in the value of what we do. This is because when I've worked in these environments, I've shown the people I'm working with what we do, performed it, and they can see its value in action. And they have, without fail, actually welcomed English and our practices and its importance and its value. But what has also become clear to me is that often, initially, they have absolutely no idea what we do, what English actually is. And here I think is where more prevalent practices of public literary studies are needed. The onus is on us to get out even more and to communicate and perform what we do better, more frequently, and in relation to a range of publics. So my recent work, as Tim kindly indicated, in theory and practice, has been committed to that communication and performance in a specific context, which is in relation to public reasoning, policy making, and high-level decision making. Story Listening was written, as Tim said, with Claire Craig. Claire was trained as a geophysicist, then moved into science policy, spent a long career in Whitehall in the civil service in the UK government, ended up heading up the science policy unit there, and then moving to head up science policy at the Royal Society. So has a background as a scientist and extensive knowledge in practice and in her intellectual work on how evidence informs policy making. We published the book in November 21, and we've been working since then on a number of collaborative projects with policymakers, putting story listening into action to start to develop and demonstrate kind of proof of concept case studies about how this can be embedded in actual environments. So we have a project on story listening and nuclear, which we have coming to the conclusion of and writing up the report at the moment, and a project on story listening and space policy, space as in that which is beyond the Earth's terrestrial atmosphere, where we have a big workshop coming up in July, and we'll be writing up that. And so by the end of the year, we're hoping to have published 2 reports that really start to showcase how this can be done and how other people can start to do it. So much of what I'm going to say is drawn from and informed by story listening, but also by reflections that I have had since writing the book about what it means for our discipline. Because it was only after I published it that I was able to retrospectively frame what we had done in it as, in fact, a new form of literary criticism, a form that in this article in Textual Practice I've called public criticism. So, if story listening is a conceptual and practical framework that enables decision makers to gather narrative evidence to form part of a pluralistic evidence base, then public criticism is the type of criticism that we as literary critics need to practice to make such evidence available. And I'm not proposing that public criticism is the only method of public engagement and interaction in 21st century literary studies, but I am proposing that as one function of public criticism amongst others, it needs to be part of a broad commitment to functional pluralism and to the cultivation of a methodological pluralism, which as I see as absolutely crucial to the vitality of our discipline moving forwards. So a number of the characteristics of public criticism as I propose it pose quite significant challenges to some embedded ideologies and practices in our discipline about the function or role of literary criticism, about the relationship of our discipline to the public sphere, and about the role of the critic. Ideologies that I think might in fact be holding us back in demonstrating and communicating our value. So, in what follows, I want to introduce some of the key ideas from story listening, but do so in the context of thinking about those challenges and how our discipline might evolve to overcome them. So, the first challenge I think public criticism presents is to our understanding of the role the objects we study and our criticism of them actually has in life and society. So, in Uses of Literature, Rita Felsky calls, you all may remember, has become a very famous book for a renewed attention to literature's connectedness with and embeddedness and action in the social world. But she notes that in many areas of literary studies, there remains a deep mistrust of the idea that literature can have a use. She says what distinguishes literature in this line of thought is its obdurate resistance to all calculations of purpose and function. But this resistance is not universal. In his The Storyteller essay, for example, Walter Benjamin identifies what he calls an indispensable element of every real story. It serves overtly or covertly a useful function. There's perhaps less resistance within literary studies to the idea of the eudaimonic functions of literature, entertainment, escape, happiness, healing, and the effective value of criticism than there is to literature and literary criticism's cognitive functions. But the cognitive value of stories in particular is in fact investigated and celebrated across other disciplines. And this was a deep irony that I encountered doing the research for this book, that whereas literary studies tends to reject the cognitive value of stories and the knowledge that we produce in our analysis of them, disciplines from sociology to anthropology to philosophy are absolutely concerned with the cognitive value, the knowledge that stories contain. So the story listening framework is designed to enable the identification and analysis and communication of the cognitive value of stories. It is, to some extent, as Tim says, a case for the importance of narrative experts, in particular in relation to important issues of contemporary debate or decision. In the book, we suggest 4 functions of stories that render them and critical engagement with them of cognitive value to public reasoning. And I'm not going to spend a lot of this talk talking about the functions, but we have talked about them at length in various other talks that are all on the Story Listening website. But just to run through them, we outline how stories enable multiple points of view, increasing knowledge and understanding of a system of relevance to public reasoning. We show how stories create and consolidate collective identities, helping identify social groups, understand motivations and actions, and recognize social norms and how they are or might be changing. We propose that stories, particularly what we call textual stories, so novels and films, stories that have been shaped and curated and embedded in a certain medium, function as narrative models functional tools that enable explanation and understanding. And we examine how stories in the final function can also serve as anticipatory narrative models, part of their wider role in anticipatory systems, imagining and testing a range of futures in order to enable better public reasoning in the present. We illustrate each function with examples with what we call performative readings pertaining to some of the key issues of contemporary public reasoning, the environment and climate crisis, exponential general purpose technologies such as AI, nuclear weapons and power, and the economy. And throughout, the case is made for the importance of narrative experts in order to analyze, communicate, and extract, if we might wish to use that word, this cognitive value. So the original impetus behind story listening came from a desire to produce a framework that would enable knowledge from our discipline and from the humanities more generally to be incorporated into and usefully inform public reasoning and policy making. It's widely acknowledged now that many of what in policy making they call wicked problems require multidisciplinary solutions. And we saw and identified an appetite for using humanities knowledge, but an inability to do so because of a lack of understanding, a lack of a framework for how to do so rigorously. We've been delighted to see story listening starting to successfully fill that gap. It's being read widely and informing research and practice across sectors and disciplines, and we hope that with the proof of concept projects, it will become embedded in practice over the next few years. Ironically, and this is on this slide, just a few of the examples of where it's being cited and taken up. Ironically, perhaps the area in which its take-up has been slowest is in literary studies itself. And I think this is because of some of the challenges I've said its approach presents. I hope that it will start to have an influence within the discipline. It's starting to. I'm seeing it come through in PhD projects and postdoc projects, because whilst I'm absolutely committed to our discipline and its value, I do think that we need to evolve and we need to develop the skills and capabilities that are necessary if we are actually going to meet the demand that absolutely exists for our knowledge and our expertise. And to do this effectively leads us, I think, to the second challenge, which is a challenge to our perception of the proper positionality of our discipline in relation to the public sphere. So to put kind of two extremes next to each other, traditional Marxist understandings of criticism, such as we see in Terry Eagleton's work, say that criticism is of value because it's a struggle against the absolutist state. And this conception of criticism's public value is guided by Jürgen Habermas's idea of the public sphere, with public reasoning being the activity of a public, here meaning a group of private people, reasoning collectively in opposition to public authorities. But criticism can also function in the context of public reasoning as defined radically differently. For instance, by Sheila Yazanoff, where she defines public reasoning as the institutional practices, discourses, techniques, and instruments through which modern governments claim legitimacy in an era of limitless risks, physical, political, and moral. So public criticism can take place within or in collaboration with institutions of power, such as those of the state, and can contribute to the practical activity of such institutions when making decisions in the public interest. There is neither, I think, a necessary nor essential relationship between literary criticism and opposition, be it political or ideological. But that does not mean that any criticism that is not ideologically informed is a form of quietism. My understanding of public criticism considers how literary criticism can function within or collaboration with structures of power without any necessity for ideological complicity to effect change, rather than always and only situating itself external to and in critique of power. The third challenge that public criticism presents is to our sense of ourselves and what our role as critics is. in a wonderful essay. It's one of my favorite contributions to the so-called method wars, the military language of which Tim and his collaborators brilliantly challenge and deconstruct in their recent special issue of Textual Practice. In A Few Lies, Queer Theory and Our Method Melodramas, David Kernick observes that the essays so often referred to within this miniature tradition, he calls it, of the method wars, are less about the way we go about things when we are engaged in criticism, and more, he says, about how we feel about ourselves when we do, offering, he says, a series of character sketches of the academic critic. Hernick is strongly critical of what he calls this pop psychology, but actually, I think attending to characterology invites consideration of other possible characters and functions of the critic. Because I think it's necessary to expand our conception of the critic's public function. The literary critic can play different roles at different times in relation to life, to society, and to our institutions. And our discipline as a whole can be collectively strengthened by different groups and individuals functioning in these different ways at different times. When it comes to seeking out a plural understanding of the function of the literary critic, we can usefully learn from the sciences, not in terms of their methods, but in terms of the learning that has amassed over some decades in the sciences regarding the different public role a scientist can play. And we are, I think, about 2 decades behind the sciences when it comes to thinking about how we can interact with public policy. But we can fast track those 2 decades by learning quickly the lessons that it took them a very long time to learn. So we could take, for instance, Roger A. Pilker Jr.'s book, The Honest Broker, Making Sense of Power of Science and Politics, as a model that might be productively adapted to the humanities. Pilker has a great website which summarizes the key arguments of the book. So it's a quick crib if you don't want to read the whole thing. And what he does is he outlines 4 idealized types of engagement that scientists can adopt depending on their view of science and of democracy when considering the range of roles they may choose to play if they wish, or if they do not wish, their research to inform public reasoning in some way. And Pilker's categories, and this is taken from his website, are presented here. We've got the pure scientist who focuses on research with ostensibly no regard for its utility. Then got the science arbiter, which is a responsive role, providing expert advice when approached by a policymaker with a specific request. There's the issue advocate, who has a desired policy outcome in mind. And then there's the honest broker of policy alternatives, one who Pilker says engages in decision making by clarifying and at times seeking to expand the range of choices available to decision makers. And Pilker's typology might usefully map onto public literary studies and, in fact, public humanities, scholarship and activity more broadly. Literary critics, I think, have traditionally inhabited the role of pure academic, pure humanist, or of issue advocate. And where literary critics are explicit about their personal values and beliefs, we can operate openly as issue advocates, intending to influence public reasoning in a particular direction. And this may include, for instance, aligning research with political activism. Pilker notes, he says, that the defining characteristic of this role, of the issue advocate role, is a desire to reduce the scope of available choice, often to a single preferred outcome among many possible outcomes. And he notes that issue advocacy, he says, is fundamental to a healthy democracy and is a noble calling. But issue advocacy is not the only possible public role a literary critic can play in relation to public reasoning. Literary critics can also function as humanities arbiters and as honest brokers. Considering the role of humanities arbiter or humanities honest broker as viable additions to our characterology, to our possible public functions as literary critics, offers, I think, new sites at which to locate both the public and the self-reflexive value of the humanities. So to spend a little longer then with these newer categories, The science arbiter, says Pilker, supports a decision maker by providing answers to questions that can be addressed empirically, that is to say, using the tools of science, often playing this role, in fact, as a member of an expert advisory committee. The literary critic, as humanities arbiter, if we map it across, can support a decision maker by providing answers to questions that can be addressed through the tools of our discipline. Also, as a member of an expert advisory committees, if such structures were to expand to accommodate us. To function in this way requires explicit explanation of and public understanding of what constitutes methodological rigor in literary studies. And I don't often put lots of text on slides, but I've put this up because very early on in our collaboration, Claire said that one of the reasons people are hesitant about using humanities knowledge is that they don't know how it guarantees its rigor. It doesn't use the scientific method. It doesn't use the randomized control trial. How do they know that the knowledge and information they're getting is reliable and trustworthy and sound? And she posed a question to me and said, how do you define rigor in your discipline? To which my answer was, I don't know. And over the course of a few years, I thought harder and harder about this question. I started by emailing one of my senior colleagues who's now retired, who sat on the Research Excellence Framework panel assessing literary studies scholarship in the UK, because I knew one of the criteria against which they were required to assess and mark that scholarship was rigor, because it's listed in the public information. So I emailed him and I said, you were asked to assess rigor, originality, and a couple of other things. How did you agree on the definition of rigor? Did you create it as a panel? And he said, no, we have no definition of rigor. We all just know what's rigorous in the humanities. And that answer will not wash outside of our disciplines. It will not provide the reassurance that others need. And so as I thought about it more and more and refined this list that's on your slide, I realized that in the end, the guarantees of rigor in literary studies and perhaps in the humanities more broadly are in fact no different at all to the guarantees of rigor in the sciences. And this was a kind of breakthrough for me. Because this list, it can be just as easily adapted to scientific knowledge as to humanities knowledge. So what guarantees rigor? Robust methods as recognized by subfield that are appropriate to their object of study. Depth and breadth of knowledge of the existing literature and the situation of one's research in relation to it. Sensitive, detailed, and acute close reading is specific to literary studies, but it could be replaced by equivalences in other disciplines. Archival research or identification by other means of new relevant material. The construction of coherent and compelling arguments substantiated by evidence gathered. Peer review. An ongoing engagement, rejection, refinement, and deployment of arguments and ideas across a field over time, leading to cumulative knowledge as well as evolution and novelty. So I don't think actually that we have a problem in answering the question of rigor. We've just got to give that answer to as many people as possible. Routine, effective, explicit, academic, and public description and communication of the methods and structures that guarantee rigor in literary studies and beyond would enable the role of the humanities arbiter to be filled more regularly, enable humanities experts to be more easily incorporated into the structures of public reasoning, and give decision makers more confidence to ask humanities experts questions and more confidence in the robustness of our answers. Coming on to the fourth character, the honest broker. To function as an honest broker rather than as an issue advocate, the literary critic must deploy their expertise to serve the public good, regardless of whether they, as citizens, are aligned in terms of politics or values with those currently in power. And I think this is a major challenge. Those the literary critic might most seek to inform may be precisely those with whom both sides feel they have least in common. I think this is a challenge at which many literary critics may well balk. So far removed is it from the alignment of our scholarship with activism. But in public criticism, this needs to be one role that the literary critic can play among many. To do so would require literary critics committed to influencing public reasoning in this way to operate both in their research practices and in public in more politically neutral ways, enabling more public trust in the non-partisan nature of their knowledge and expertise. Public trust in humanities scholarship, including in literary criticism, is therefore dependent on greater communication and understanding of the robustness of our methods, and on either a clear statement of the personal political values influencing the research, making that statement in the full knowledge, in fact, that this could make your engagement less effective, in the sense that the research becomes conflated with and therefore easily dismissed as only an academic version of an already well understood political position. Or a public trust in humanities scholarship is dependent on developing and practicing research methods that mitigate in some ways against personal beliefs and politics. One way of achieving the latter is through a greater emphasis on collaboration and synthesis in our research practices. Since a decision maker within the structures of public reasoning may be more confident of the value of insights that come from a given field of research, if it's clear that the knowledge is produced by researchers with different political leanings and sets of values. So public criticism must include synthesis as a valuable and important method, both the task of bringing together existing knowledge within a discipline and knowledge across disciplines of relevance to a question of importance to public reasoning. And synthesis, I think, can be illustrated in an adaptation of our original diagram, where what is required by -D, so anything that is not our discipline, is a synthesis of knowledge in the discipline or disciplines. A kind of meta level of practice is needed, where the object of study becomes the knowledge of one's own discipline that needs to be mapped and assessed in order to draw out its relevance to the topic that -D is interested in. This constitutes an evolution of the humanities in that part of its methods now has to include the ability to bring together information and knowledge from a range of sources within or across disciplines to inform debates or decisions on specific issues outside the academy. Where the new context of the humanities practice is the policy-making environment, synthesis is an absolutely crucial method. It requires looking systematically across the research available within the relevant disciplines and in an expert fashion, making judgment about what is relevant to the policy question, conveying this for an audience outside the discipline, and doing so in a way that includes uncertainty, disagreement, and contention, where it's important for those stakeholders outside the discipline to be aware of them. So synthesis, and this is where it matches to some extent the honest broker, is not about advocating for a particular academic approach, argument, theory, or method, nor for a particular policy solution or worldview. Rather, it's a process of mapping the range of evidence that is potentially relevant and is academically robust, describing the terrain and the difference between the various elements of it. Synthesis requires two important things. Lexical flexibility, in that the communication of the synthesized knowledge must be accessible to anyone outside the academy who's not an expert on the material, but who can be assumed to be willing to read carefully and thoughtfully. It also requires what I call value flexibility, in that humanities scholars are inevitably drawn to and rewarded for creating new knowledge. And the generative effects of synthesis tend not to be included within that categorization. But whilst it might be different from original research, synthesis is valuable and difficult, requiring its own forms of rigor, creativity, and judgment. Now, you'll have seen from the slide before that the British Academy in the UK is starting to move towards creating syntheses of humanities evidence. Although this report on COVID-19 recovery actually privileges social science evidence, there's less humanities evidence, and I think there's maybe one footnote to literary studies. So even within the body in the UK that's advocating for us, we haven't yet conveyed to them that, for instance, if they had included in what is a very good document a section on narrative evidence about pandemics, for instance, they might have been able to add to the existing synthesis. And the other way in which synthesis has become important and figured in my recent work is that I'm currently working with two colleagues, Zoe Bolitis, who's at Birmingham University in the UK, and Jeff Wilson, who's at Harvard, on a new open access journal with Cambridge University Press called Public Humanities. It's going to have 3 strands, and the middle strand is going to be syntheses, special issues that do exactly what I've just described, that synthesis work across and within disciplines of relevance to a specific issue. The peer reviews we've had back on the proposal for the journal have been fascinating in the sense of absolutely acknowledging the need for synthesis and at the same time saying, but humanities scholars can't do it. And my response to that is that's exactly why we need the journal. So we need to start building the skills and the capacities that are going to enable us to start to synthesize and communicate and showcase our knowledge in ways that are useful and helpful. And that means presenting it in ways that other people value rather than perhaps necessarily in the ways that we value. So public criticism then is inherently interdisciplinary and intersectoral. In his essay Criticism and Truth, which sort of took off in 2021, published in Critical Inquiry, Jonathan Kramnik calls for, he says, an understanding of how a reading of a poem on, for example, the topic of harvesting apples might be of interest for a scholar working on sustainable agriculture. Such an understanding, he says, would provide the ground for ongoing conversations and collaborations among disciplines. Public criticism, as I have presented it here, provides that understanding. And one example of public criticism, our book, Story Listening, offers the ground not just for collaboration among disciplines, but across sectors, providing an implementable framework for how a story about harvesting apples might be of interest not just to a scholar working on sustainable agriculture, but to the policymakers tasked with designing agricultural policy. In conclusion, then, the goal of story listening is ambitious: to embed story listening in advisory systems at all levels and to establish as routine the drawing on narrative evidence created by narrative experts. This policy world goal might sound far away from some of the issues that we are currently facing, at least in the UK, and I'd be very keen to hear about the state on the continent. Some of the issues we are currently facing, such as departmental closures and drops in student numbers. But everything is connected. If the valuing of humanities knowledge, including literary criticism, becomes commonplace, for example, in the UK context across Whitehall, which is where the civil service and policymakers are based, then it will change the profile of what we do and increase understanding of what we do in the same corridors where decisions are being made, for instance, about educational and curriculum policy. In turn, we can use it along with the communication of other methods possible in public literary studies to engage with teachers and secondary school pupils, to demonstrate that there are multiple ways of undertaking our discipline, multiple values in doing so, and that they will get to explore these further if they go on to study the discipline in higher education. In turn, and this is where my sights are set, I think, over the next sort of 5 to 10 years, is it might diversify and inform what we teach and how we teach. Story listening is changing how I work with my postdocs and my postgraduate students, hasn't yet made it down into how I teach undergraduates. And I think we're going to have to build it in right there at the beginning of our undergraduate curriculum design, so that the students that we educate who go out into the world to a whole range of jobs will have a more pluralistic understanding of our discipline and be versed with a range of ways to communicate and demonstrate and practice its value, even if they don't go on to work in specifically kind of literary studies contexts. None of this will happen without time and effort, but it is time and effort that many people in the UK are already putting in, that it's clear you guys are thinking about, not least with this very series, and that's happening at local and national levels. I hope that the ideas of story listening and public criticism and the changes I am starting to see it make in my public encounters will provide you with additional tools to work with in yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Excellent stuff. I'm fascinated. Oh, but you know I'm fascinated, so I'm not telling you anything new. Is there, from the side of the audience, anything that you might want to take the opportunity to ask Sarah? Because it's a very valuable opportunity. And the thing is, if I were to ask things now, they rapidly go sort of very specific. So I'll start with you guys and see where I end up. And I think you have to ask me to unmute you. And be aware that you will be on the recording. So show of hands and I will unmute you. Yeah, let's see if this works. Yeah.
First of all, thank you so much for your thought-provoking and inspiring talk. I want to start with, so I'm not from this field, so excuse me if I come up with irrelevant questions. But from the first moment on, it made me really curious how we could handle the dangers of an optimistic thought. So what I mean by that is, as much as I want to believe such a connection is indeed possible and valid, how to go about it brings about its dangers, right? It reminded me of, recently I came across some articles which connected the prevalence of post-truth and populist politics today to the transmission of postmodern thought. And this is surely not what postmodern thinkers imagined. And obviously there was a form of miscommunication in between, but how to make this communication without overly reducing the content and complexity of academic thought.
Yeah. Well, I missed at the beginning, you said the dangers of something thinking, and I don't know what it was. Mystical, magical.
Optimistic thinking.
Optimistic thinking. Oh, okay. Well, yes, I am an inveterate optimist. I should say that because of the multi sort of sector and disciplinary environments I work in, questions from places of ignorance are always the most useful, actually. So I think never apologize for asking a question when you're coming to something from outside of it, because you see things differently. The question you have asked is one we have had many times before, and we call it the post-truth objection. And so this is something that's come up quite a lot. We had a piece published in the big American magazine Science earlier this year, where we addressed this head on. And then there was a letter and our response published in a subsequent edition. So I think you're referring possibly to Bruno Latour's When Critique Runs Out of Steam, where he sort of has this moment of horror that the arguments he's made that founded science technology studies are, you know, coming back to bite them, basically, in terms of justifying the kinds of thinking and reasoning that underlie post-truth. I have a PhD student working on conspiracy theory in the contemporary novel at the moment and thinking about conspiracy as a sort of mode of academic criticism. So she's doing interesting work on that. Our answer to the post-truth objection is that this is exactly why story listening is needed. So the example, to give a kind of tangible example, a good while back now, there was a Senate hearing on climate change in the US. And Inhofe, I think he was called, one of the Republican senators who was an outspoken climate denier. gave to the committee Michael Crichton's State of Fear to read, which is a rollicking sort of political thriller about climate change, but with footnotes. The novel has footnotes. And then he called Crichton to testify at the hearing on climate change. And the problem with that was manifold. One, a single novel was being taken in order to mobilize a certain partisan position. So it's both an example of narrative evidence being used, but in fact an example of narrative evidence being misused. So the foundations of our argument in story listening is that people are already making decisions all the time based on stories. They're making decisions based on anecdotes. They're making decisions based on the storyline of the most recent soap opera that they're watching. They're making decisions based on the novel that they read the night before. But just as there would be no tolerance for decision making based on just randomly what scientific paper someone had read, or what scientific paper was being covered in the news that week, there need to be structures and rigorous frameworks put in place for taking narrative evidence into account carefully and legitimately. And if we don't have those structures, we're going to actually descend precisely into the misuse of stories and the misuse of stories as evidence. So story listening is there to counteract that. It offers the same kind of framework and the same kind of robust filtering process that we already have in science. Scientific evidence can be misused. There's no, but that's not been a reason to not use scientific evidence. There's been a reason to make sure there are structures in place to, as far as possible, inhibit that misuse. The other reason the State of Fear example is really interesting is that recent work actually in science and technology studies has very interestingly shown that the way in the value of the novel, the cognitive value of the novel, is the way in which it actually models precisely the relationship between truth, knowledge, science, and political systems that reflects the post-truth era in the States. So and this is where narrative experts are needed. So it shouldn't have been Michael Crichton who was called to testify at that Senate hearing. It should have been a narrative expert who would have been able to point out that State of Fear is not a mimetically legitimate narrative model of climate science, but it is a very useful narrative model of structures of interaction between science, policy, knowledge, truth, and trust. And so this is the case for the narrative experts, that they are there to, with their expertise, mediate and demonstrate where texts have cognitive value and where actually they are dangerous, misleading, seductive. So that's the example we use to show the necessity of narrative experts and the necessity of story listening, that it is not going to lead us into a descent into post-truth, but actually the use of narrative experts and the development of widespread narrative literacy, we call it, is going to be absolutely essential to combat the kinds of things that are happening in the public sphere through the use of narratives in politics and through just the massively wider dissemination of stories as social media and digital platforms continue to expand.
Excellent, thank you. Good question. Excellent answer. Thank you very much. Yeah, anybody else? Otherwise, I can tell it. I'll tell an anecdote. No, I don't have to, because Torsten Schmidt saves me from telling anecdotes, which is always good. I'll unmute you in a second.
Well, I'm totally happy for you to tell an anecdote, because, I mean, first of all, thank you. And it just reminded me that I actually need to finish this book that I picked up a long while ago. And that's a pretty good effort. On that note of anecdote, I got two questions. Wouldn't it be absolutely necessary for scientists in this particular field to become better storytellers themselves in order to somewhat captivate audiences and lure them towards the usefulness that they can provide to whatever field.
You said 2 questions. That was one. Is there a second one?
That was one, yeah. And the other one, especially when you're talking about the robustness of the methods, obviously that's a black hole in itself. And but how are you going to achieve that when the reality in the classroom is that a lot of people doing literary studies seem to be somewhat afraid of reading, and the actual discourse that's happening there is mostly informed by whatever is just pulled the instant a question has been posed off Wikipedia or ChatGPT these days. And I mean, I'm totally happy to derail any argument and any discussion, but that obviously causes derailings that are usually very hard, especially for the lecturers, to somehow rein in. And if that is the actual field we're talking from and the very base level, we're not going to make the most profound argument for the usefulness of our discipline, are we?
We can. I'll take the first question first. So it's been quite funny to Claire and I how quickly, when people see the book, literally see it, or hear us talk about it, they move from story listening to storytelling. And this happened to Claire at an event where she was literally standing next to the book, and the person who came to talk to her said, "Oh, I work on storytelling as well." And the book is, in one sense, not about storytelling. Its intention is not to help politicians or scientists tell better stories. I am sure that it could be used perhaps to do that, but that is not what we're concerned with. There's a whole field of work on science communication and a whole field of consultancies who help scientists tell better stories. There's a lack of consensus actually about whether scientists telling better stories is helpful or not in terms of confidence in scientific evidence, actually. So we very much see that as a separate body of work that we are not in any way attempting to intervene in. So that would be the answer to the first one. The answer to the second one is very interesting. We thought for a long time about our definition of terms. And as far as we're concerned, story is used in the most capacious sense if it can be. So we are not just talking about novels, although I do tend to revert to those in my off the cuff examples because of my disciplinary background. We distinguish between textual stories and non-textual stories, and I mentioned this in the talk. So textual stories will be stories that are curated and embedded, so things like films, novels, television programs. But non-textual stories takes into account things like what's circulating online, what personal narratives or accounts of individual or collective experiences, all these more ephemeral stories that can change and morph and aren't kind of embedded in a certain medium. And I didn't talk about this in the talk, but I do think that one of the other challenges to 21st century literary studies is recognizing that our skills are of value and of use across that range of different types of narrative. So if we restrict what we think our proper objects of study are to the novel or lyric poetry or whatever, if we restrict it to that, we don't recognize that there's a both and, that actually we could also be thinking about the relevance and value of our skills and expertise to other types of narratives in the 21st century. From a public literary studies position, we are scuppering and hampering some of our value and use. The number of times I see people talking about narrative, publishing on narrative in policy spaces, in other disciplines, with no mention of literary studies, no turn to narrative experts, no inclusion of narrative experts on joint authorship or panels, that there's a kind of a sort of a blindness to the fact that that's what we do. Not only what we do, because we work on poetry as well, but we work on stories, we work on narrative, we are experts in that. And that blindness can't just be laid at their feet. That has to be something about a lack of flexibility in our discipline, in recognizing that we can extend our skills beyond the traditional objects of study. So, in terms of in the classroom, I'm lucky, I guess. I know that where I work is a very privileged space, and we can still expect everybody to have, read the novels and want to talk about them or watch the films or whatever. But I think we can work with our pedagogy in a way that flexibly shows the students that the skills that we can teach them can be used in order to develop their narrative literacy when they're engaging with something that they've read online, but that there's also still value in engaging with these longer form narrative models which can help them think about different things. And so I guess embracing the fact that things are changing, but remaining true to a sense of the kind of core skills that we can teach, but being flexible about what those skills can be brought to bear upon and how and where.
Thank you for the question. I'll pass on a question in a second, but because it came up and now my anecdote actually has some kind of value, and I think I already emailed Sarah the anecdote. I read Sarah's book and Craig's book last spring. And I immediately went and said, I'm going to write about this and what I'm doing. I'm going to find an example of where does it work in Germany? And I emailed the representative for the COVID expert council about whether or not that they had any literary scholars or actually any humanities scholars on their board. And they were very, very leery over 3 email exchanges of commenting on this in any way except to say that they have an interdisciplinary board of experts that accounts for various kinds of disciplinary expertise. And so I wrote back and okay, like a literary scholar? It's well, lots of experts. And I said, have you even asked? Or have you considered asking? And they were like, as I said, right, lots of experts. By the way, don't quote us in your official writings. I was like, okay, you haven't, right? You don't want to admit you haven't. You have not a good rationale for this either. But it seems very apropos of this sort of they were completely baffled by the question as such, right? Why would we kind of response to this? So, but it's just an anecdote, right? I have a question in the chat. I'll read it out.
Can I come back on the anecdote, Tim, before we the question, which is, I think one of the things that Claire and I haven't done yet is written about COVID, because we feel like it's too present still in certain ways, particularly with the COVID inquiry that's going on in the UK. But I think it's a good anecdote because it's utterly baffling to me why they wouldn't. If you, for instance, look at least what UK publics and French publics were doing during the pandemic, which was turning to pandemic narratives to try and make sense of the experience that they were going through. So Camus' The Plague shot up the bookseller charts across countries globally. Contagion, the film, started to rise in the Netflix rankings or whatever. The publics that these decision makers are beholden to were looking to plague literature, if we call it that, and they weren't looking to it for escapism or solace. They were looking to it for its cognitive value, how to make sense of that which they were experiencing. So at the very least, a kind of COVID body would need a narrative expert in order to, and this comes back to our second function, look at the way in which narratives were collecting and cohering public identities during the pandemic. At the very least, that would be useful. But more than that, I'll exchange an anecdote for an anecdote. Our then Health Secretary, Matt Hancock, much maligned now, cited the film Contagion as the reason for him starting UK inquiries into vaccination very, very early in the process. And I think it is not disputed that he at least got that right. And Contagion is very interesting because actually when Claire was in government, she staged a screening of Contagion when it came out. They asked her if she would stage a screening of Contagion with kind of policymakers and epidemiologists, because the filmmakers worked really hard to make at least some of it mimetically accurate. And when there is, I don't know how many of you know the film, but there's a moment in the film where R is explained, you know, the number of the replication number. And there was a cheer from the epidemiologists in the room that the film had kind of portrayed and explained this part of their science correctly. I mean, it gets other things wrong. It is melodramatic in certain ways, but it also gets the kind of plague denier element right in its narrative. So again, a narrative expert to look at that, and we are not arguing that a single film, if a policymaker watches it, is then going to help them make better decisions. That is not the argument. The argument is the need for synthesis of evidence. But it's a nice anecdote in the sense that whilst Hancock was kind of happy to admit that, it was seen as something slightly funny, you know, something that was just curious, and the news outlets covered it because, you know, mainstream film influences Health Secretary. But actually it speaks to this larger recognition on the part of the decision makers and on the part of the publics that stories could help at this moment to make sense of what was happening. So it should have been there, and it should have been in the British Academy report, and we need to make that happen.
Yeah, I agree. I have the question in the chat. I'll just read it out so you don't have to find the chat. It's from Elizabeth. And it returns us to the classroom, and she asks us about your discussions in the classroom around the questions that you've raised, specifically around public criticism and the question of how confident you are that your students actually know the values and uses of what they study for the public sphere. How do they see those values? Where do they see them?
That's a really good question, Elizabeth. Thank you. As I said, I don't think that I brought this down to at least undergraduate level yet in the way that I want to. Neither within my actual classroom teaching nor within curriculum design, although that's very difficult in some ways at Cambridge because we don't have a curriculum as such. But that's a conversation for another day. I think my postdocs and my PhD students have picked this up very quickly and see it as an opportunity. I did a very big project. It was on one of the early slides on histories of AI right through the pandemic. And what became increasingly clear to me working with my postdoc on that and other members of the team, and this came up at the Functions of Criticism conference as well, actually, was a sense of frustration and nihilism, actually, that if you ground the humanities claims for value on the basis that literature, for instance, or reading literature, you know, is a site of oppositional critique and makes us politically active and changes the world, and that's what literary criticism or other forms of humanities kind of do, and then you realize that it hasn't. Although, you know, it has. We wouldn't have the rights we have for women or other things if there hadn't been, you know, feminism supported and located within the academy. So it's both and, always with me. But if you do set your stall there and then you feel like you haven't effected change, then that leads to a lot of self-questioning about why on earth you're doing what you're doing in the first place. And then rather than writing about, for instance, critical race studies in relation to AI, actually what you should be is out there organizing with communities who are affected by this. So that, and I, part of the public criticism work was responding to seeing that sense of hopelessness actually in some of my early career colleagues, and trying to think of offering them hope by offering them a different model for how they might interact. So, and I see people picking that up. So I have a PhD starting in the autumn who is working on what we call in the UK coercive control, and looking at narratives of coercive control across this capacious definition of narratives. So looking at legal narratives, looking at policy narratives, looking at how it's represented in storylines in UK radio and television, and using the story listening approach to combined with, and the story listening approach is dependent upon literary studies core skills, to analyze and map those narratives and then make recommendations about how they are influencing policy if they are not interrogated properly, and how learning from them might change and inform policy making around coercive control. So it's a really exciting, real, practical but literary studies project. And I know that what story listening has done has given people who wanted to do that kind of work a framework to do it, and a way to legitimize what they wanted to do. So I think it's happening at postdoc level. I think it's happening at PhD level. I'm not sure yet that it's happening at undergraduate level, and it's certainly not feeding back into secondary education. So there's what we would call a pipeline issue there, and lots of people, there's a very national local context, which is changes to the school curriculum in English over the last few years, which have bottomed out people taking it at A level, which then bottoms out people applying for it at university. A kind of regressive understanding or idea of what literary studies is that has been now implemented in our national curriculum. That has to change. So I guess it's a kind of reverse pipeline. I'm seeing that as, hopefully, as it's starting to kind of percolate down. But it has prompted me, as it's prompted you, Elizabeth, to actually maybe ask these questions in my undergraduate classes or in my MPhil classes in a way that I haven't done so yet.
Excellent. Thank you very much. I do have another question, but I'm happy to defer to whoever else is intrigued by something. You still have a couple of minutes, so maybe something come up. It's going to be just a very straightforward, like, literary studies kind of question, which is, you spoke about just now, right? How it changes what we teach or how we teach. And the question is sort of about what we teach, because it seems to me that a lot of the stuff that you've cited also quoted in story listening is stuff that is not sort of the most narrow of canons, right? It's not the sort of standard English kind of start with Chaucer and end with, Martin Ames probably now, right? And then you've got this sort of group of great writers, and those are the people you study, because now you get this, right? You get the Michael Crichtons who suddenly become important, or in Germany, right, people like Frank Schätzing or something like that, who are really sort of very off to the side in the niche of genre. And they become important for this kind of project because they become the kind of thing that you can actually then reference, right? And one of the questions then is, how do you think about canonization and canonicity in this context?
Yeah, I have a little book called How to Study the Contemporary, which I'm aiming to finish when I'm on research leave in the autumn, based on a series of lectures that I wrote for Cambridge students a couple of years ago. And one of the chapters of that book is on the canon. So it's something that I've been thinking about a lot in relation to contemporary literary studies, but obviously more broadly. This is a kind of follow-on to my thoughts from Elizabeth's question as well, which is, I wonder if maybe there's a case that actually possibly not much should or does need to change at undergraduate level. I'm playing, I'm not sure whether I agree with this, but in the sense that, do we need to still kind of build core skills and what we would consider core knowledge and make sure those foundations are in place before we then sort of start to build on that and expand? I don't know, but that could be one argument for a sense of a kind of, these are the skills that you need in literary studies. These are the kind of, just be honest about it, you know, these are the canonical texts of the Western canon that we still think, you know, everyone who's got an English degree should know. And then sort of expand upon that. In a way, the Cambridge Tripos does do that, in the sense that in the first 2 years you do these kind of big period papers, and then in the third year you get to select from a kind of smorgasbord of more specific and often kind of research-led papers, and then of course when you go on to masters you get to do that even more. So maybe there's a case for that kind of evolution, or there's a case for like radical overhaul, which I think would need to keep the kind of core skills and methods, but could teach from the very beginning a curriculum that's not designed around the canon and not designed around a kind of progression through great literature, but could be designed, for instance, around narratives and core themes, or poetry and core themes. And so you just hit them straight in the first year with their climate crisis course, or their whatever course. I don't I don't know, but that maybe we do need to think radically about our pedagogy to some degree and shake it up if we want to re-energize, well, particularly in the UK, if we want to re-energize numbers. I would very much like to see more interdisciplinarity at undergraduate level, and I would actually love to see public literary studies built in at an undergraduate level in a way that it at least isn't in my university. I am thinking of a bid at some point in the future. The UKRI, the UK's sort of funding council, has collaborative doctoral awards now, where you get funding for a PhD student who's both based in an academic department and somewhere outside. So we have a couple with the British Library, but I think getting some story listening collaborative doctoral awards, where you've got some students based in a literary studies department but also based in a government policy department, and doing a project that kind of meets the needs and develops both of those partners, is I don't think it should replace the kind of self-directed thesis project traditional model, but as a both and, as a build-in, as a different type of doctoral model, I think it's fantastic. But what would it mean, for instance, to build into an undergraduate literary studies degree a policy placement or an industry placement? They're built into other kinds of degrees, or a year abroad in a language degree. Like, what would it mean to actually build into our undergraduate curriculum and require them to do forms of engagement as part of their English studies degree? That again would be quite a radical change to our pedagogy, but I think it would be really interesting and exciting.
Yep, thank you. Yeah, Anna. Wait, I got to, there we are.
Hi, Anna. Oh, I still can't hear you.
Mic's on, but we still can't hear you. That's weird.
Can you hear me now? Yeah. Yes, perfect. I'm sorry. Yeah, thank you for the talk and the discussion so far. It made me looking forward even more to our workshop, which is coming in Munich in July. And I found especially interesting what you said about the need to cope with the widespread assumption that the humanities are somehow not as reliable or sound as the natural sciences or social sciences. But I was wondering whether your answer that the rigor and the scientific standards of the humanities are not that different from the sciences, and that we need to communicate that fact more to stakeholders outside academia. So I'm talking about we as humanities people, because first, isn't the idea of the rigor of the sciences a story itself, which the humanities would have the tools to question and wouldn't be also another way to emphasize and communicate the very special qualities of humanities, which are, for example, questioning the structure or the functioning of different stories. So to emphasize the qualities that sciences may not have to this degree. I don't know if this is a too idealistic stance, but yeah, would be interested with you.
Yeah, I think that comes back a little bit maybe to Elif's question as well, yes. To some extent, and the kind of crisis in STS as yes. They realized that the work that they'd done might have contributed to the entire devaluation of facts and truth. I think there is a limit to the extent to which it is sensible or possible to undermine the rigor of scientific knowledge. I actually am a kind of great believer in the rigor of all forms of knowledge if produced properly, actually. And this is not to say that objectivity, isn't a construct. I've read that very wonderful and brilliant book. It's not to say that scientists are not human beings who may have, racist or sexist or other personal views. What it is to say is that I think that science has tried to put in place, at least recently, structures that mitigate against that to some extent. I'm not saying historically, but at least recently. And that one of the values of humanities knowledge might be to question, to challenge, to destabilize, but at least in relation to the context that I'm thinking in and working in, that's not always very helpful because what decision makers need is reliable knowledge and evidence that's going to help them make good decisions. And so saying, oh, well, that's a difficult problem, and then they'll be like, right, but what do I do? Not what do I do? That's their decision, but on the basis of what can I make my decisions? So it doesn't mean that actually when you interact in that space, you might make them realize that they're asking the wrong questions. It's not that we're subservient entirely to their agenda, but that we can respond to it, but also deliver to them things that do unsettle them. Like, that's still possible, but there has to be an argument for the value of the humanities as a form of reliable knowledge production. And that is different, I think, than the value of humanities as a form of, I guess we can use the word critique. And I think it's both and. There's space and important and uses for both of those things. Specifically in relation to public reasoning, it's the former rather than the latter that is going to be most useful and helpful. That's a careful answer because it's a big question. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I'm not sure, I have to admit, but I think you said questioning things is I mean, it is often seen as a way to destabilize things, and I'm wondering whether it couldn't be a possible mode of thinking where it doesn't lead to only deconstruction and leaving nothing behind. So the classical idea of the destructionalist mode of post-structuralist thought, but if there could be a way to in a more if it could be possible to encourage people to somehow live with complexity, so that and if this couldn't help, for example, dealing with conspiracy theorists, which in my understanding have a lot to do with some kind of of not being able to cope with a specific form of complexity. So and the need to simplify things, and if not, humanities could be the place where we could somehow encourage ways to deal with this complexity and to have a political impact in such a direction. But I'm not sure about that. It's just what I'm thinking about.
Yeah, and I'm thinking about the nuclear report, which I'm writing up at the moment. We're writing up at the moment, based out of the nuclear story listening exercise, where actually, as a sneak preview to some of the findings in that report, but what we discovered was the absolute dominance of 20th century narratives in 21st century nuclear policymaking.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, a kind of rigid dominance. And what the narrative evidence was showing was that a lot of the questions that the policymakers were asking, that they kind of knew they needed to start thinking about, requires them to recognize and start to loosen the grip of those 20th century narratives. So what part of the nuclear report is doing is accounting for those narratives and their dominance, but also offering and suggesting other narratives that might be taken into account now in relation to contemporary nuclear decision making. So it's not that the story listening exercise doesn't challenge and complexify. It does, but in a way that offers that challenging and complexity actually as kind of evidence, rather than just as a oppositional stance. Yeah. And so I think it's maybe what you do with it and how you deploy it and present it, and the breadth of the way you do it. So this is the kind of honest broker rather than issue advocate kind of contrast. That means it can be of use. And so rather than saying just, the narrative of deterrence has held sway and it's wrong, and you shouldn't be making decisions on the basis of that, it's saying there is a narrative about deterrence. This is where it comes from. This is how it developed. This is how it's still being operational. These are more why that might be causing certain challenges to policy making in a 21st century environment that's different to, the Cold War environment. And here are other possible narratives that we have found and discovered through our exercise and our synthesis that could be taken into account alongside that. The policymaker might then still go, great, but we still think deterrence is the right one, you know, and that's not our job as scholars. That's their job as decision makers, and in the end, the job of democratically elected representatives. But there's a slight difference there, I think, to almost the tone in which it's presented, that might be helpful or useful to think about.
Very fascinating. All very fascinating. But I'm sort of in the middle between those two positions for various reasons. And I'm just using the opportunity of having like the mute key at my disposal to say one of the things that I found very useful in the aftermath of reading in the book was to make me think about what I think the knowledge of literary studies is, and also what kind of an instrumental value there is to framing the things I would maybe not at first glance identify as knowledge, right? To say that interpretation well done, right? Maybe even the Kramnik sense of well wrought, right? Sort of well written,
yeah.
well crafted, yeah, is in fact knowledge. And to pitch that, right, and to sort of go and say it's not different from other, well, it's different from other knowledges in the way that all knowledges are probably different, but it's not categorically, it's not ontologically different, right? It is still knowledge, and that sort of helps reframe how you think about the discipline as a whole.
Yeah, Kramnik gave one of the other keynotes that functions of criticism, you know, talking about inline citation like he does in Criticism of Truth. And I mean, I had a conversation with him afterwards, and it comes back to your question of canon, actually, which is that his arguments and claims for the knowledge of essentially close reading are dependent on a concept of close reading that is actually a form of line by line practical criticism that doesn't account for other types of formalism, for instance, narratology. So no discussion of the formalism that's required to analyze and understand the operations of the longer narrative form, you know, like frame narratives or multi-narratives or focalization, you know, all of that stuff. And also that is dependent on a certain canon of literature, and that doesn't account for the way in which, for instance, science fiction produces knowledge necessarily. So I think I agree with a lot of his work, and I am interested in the case that he's making, but I think it's partial, and constrained to some extent by the form of attention that he prefers and the form of text that he operates it upon.
Yeah, I'll get you a beer in Munich, and I need to talk to you about that some more. Was there anything that you would like to add or ask? I saw your hand. I just preempted you. You know how it is.
I think what you just said beforehand, and both you and Mr. Lansendorfer sort of tied back to the very first question, where I wasn't arguing for offering public speech help to politicians or whatever. I guess they got their people for that. I was more arguing for people with such a vast amount of knowledge and everything they can synthesize from it. Shouldn't they hold themselves insanely accountable for making sure that the way they present it is enticing enough? And or in a very facetious way, why was it a historian like Harari, who is in that place now of being the public intellectual, and he's probably telling people more about narratives and the role of story than other people have in 50 years prior to him? Why wasn't there a literary studies person?
Yeah,
that was just the impetus there.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, both and. We need public intellectuals, but actually I don't think that's where the significant systemic change is going to happen. I think it's going to happen in this much more structural, systemic embeddedness of syntheses of knowledge. And that is not about charisma. That is not about persuasiveness. It's about much more mundane things like rigor and reliability. So it's always a risk, because particularly in our current day and age, the elite cuers, the louder voices, the more charismatic personalities have a lot of sway. So maybe we do need, you know, more literary studies public intellectuals that are doing that well. But that's not the case that we're making, and nor where I really believe the important change is going to come from and happen, I think.
I think that's a terrible segue, sorry, that we will close it on that note, because I think it sums up very well, in a nutshell, what the argument of sorry listening was and what we've been talking about today. I'll say for the group, small, but very, very good. So thank you for being here, group. I'll say thank you to you, Sarah, for doing this presentation and doing the Q&A. It was lovely and we learned a lot. I will shut off the recording now.